Night air clings to the castle like damp cloth, the fog lifting in pale threads that catch the pulse of blue and red. The grass is wet enough to darken the cuffs of the officers' trousers as they step, set down numbered markers, whisper into radios, and lift their flashlights toward the cut in the soil. A tripod lamp hums without apology. It throws a white cone against the old wall, painting the stone in harsh relief, chiseling each seam, each lichen bloom, each age-pocked crevice. Near the lip of the shallow pit, scraps of fabric cling to mud the color of old tea. A bracelet glints once and then settles into stillness, as if remembering a wrist. Earlier, she was a photograph in warm daylight. Olivia Hartwell, 40, the camera angled up slightly, the castle behind her a charming joke, a vacation postcard. The corners of the image are ordinary ivy, parapets, the warm crenellations you notice only when the guide tells you to. Her smile is the practiced sort that launches 1,000 investor breakfasts, open, straight, conveying you can trust me with your dreams. She had posted nothing about the trip beyond a private story to her inner circle, and yet the company's PR team had felt the ripples even before she touched down. She was in Europe to disappear into silence, they said, to be briefly unreachable, to refill the well. No one had added that she frequently did her best thinking in ugly, beautiful places with broken histories. No one had said she slept better with stone at her back when her driver turned off the main road and onto the track that funneled between hedges and an abandoned orchard. She had leaned forward to see the tower as it rose, not like a threat, but like an old animal standing to stretch. The castle's name had been revised by 12 families and 3 wars. The locals called it the Old Fort, and glanced at the hill the way sailors glance at a mild sea. Her assistant had sent hot tea and legal documents on the flight. Both had cooled by the time she signed them. She tucked the pen behind her ear, sat back, and watched the moon tilt like a plate catching sink light. She had fled millions of eyes for a handful of ravens, and one gatekeeper with a ring of iron keys. The keeper was a woman with hair, too, red to be natural and hands too clean to be of this place. "You'll have the south wing, Miss Hartwell," she'd said, falling into the habit everyone had of making Olivia smaller by removing the title that frightened them. "The view's for poets. The heat is for men with money. You've brought both, and that's rare." Her laugh peeled off the wall and died, embarrassed at its echo. She walked Olivia to the suite herself, pointing out the peculiarities. The tiny door beneath the stairs that went nowhere. The draught that exited through the chapel wall like a ghost peering out. The small black birds that nested beside a slit window and spat at shiny things. On her first night, before the moon climbed to the middle of the sky, Olivia left the window open and listened to the wind search the courtyard. She made herself a promise that she had made before and kept for minutes at a time. She would not check the dashboard. She would not read the numbers that judged her sleep. She would not read the remarks from men who thought they understood her business better than she did because they were older and had heavier watches. She waited until she could hear owls, and only then allowed her mind to walk back to the reason she had come. The board wanted the pivot to be public within the quarter. The journalists had their hands around the edges of it, tugging. The regulators had that squint they save for visionaries. Prove you're not just breaking a rule because it's there. She had never been sentimental about disruption. She was almost puritanical about breaking things only when not breaking them was worse. But the lawsuits were a current tightening around her ankles. And Daniel, her ex-husband, had found that no one listened to him more closely than when he spoke gently about her mistakes. He had learned that during the divorce, in the theater of those months, where each small cruelty wore a neutral face, he gave interviews that read like prayers for her safekeeping. He would weave phrases like "we're better as friends," and "she's brilliant," but tired, and the public drank the words because they tasted like concern and not like smoke. He knew how to see through her, and he knew how to be seen caring, and he weaponized both. He had been the second best thing she'd ever done, and then the worst thing she ever had to undo. He could tell when she was about to turn a corner long before she'd signaled, and now he had a map to every street she took. On the second day, a local journalist spotted a black SUV cresting the hill and guessed poorly but loudly. By evening, a blog whose font choices always looked urgent reported that the billionaire CEO was seeking solace at a mysterious fortress. 1,000 captions wrote themselves. For 48 hours, she drank coffee, walked the ramparts, and let a dog that belonged to no one guide her through the orchard skeletons. The dog would stop in the same place every afternoon, stand very still, and then decide everything was fine. She wondered what the dog remembered that she couldn't see. She wondered what the castle remembered that the guidebooks didn't say. On the third night, the gatekeeper asked if she wanted a tour of the underworks. "It's the sort of thing rich people like," she said, without malice. "A story that's older than they are. Something to put their name on in the end." Olivia smiled and said yes. She followed the woman by lantern, down a set of steps whose measurements were wrong for feet built after 1700, and she let her hand slide along the wall where fingers had slicked the stone for centuries. The underworks smelled like dry coin and old wheat. There was a hole in one wall near the ground where air slipped, a thin breath. "That goes nowhere," the keeper said. "It's a swallow run. They made them to keep curses in winter from settling." She said it lightly, a tour guide's superstition. But the air that came through was cold enough to temper coffee. That night, Olivia dreamed that the wall opened for her like a mouth, and she stepped into an echo that shaped itself around her body. She woke with the sour taste of news in her mouth, reached for her phone, and let it go dark again. She thought of Daniel reading her calendar. He could always predict what she would do next, because she had told him once, in the sort of honesty that costs. "I go straight at the thing I'm afraid of." He had said, "That's brave." He had meant, "That's simple." On the fourth day, she walked deeper into the grounds with a different guide, an archivist from the nearby university, who had been cataloging the castle's ongoing surrender to gravity. He was precisely the sort of man Daniel mocked and secretly envied, soft-voiced and bright, his hands stained by the pencil more than by earth. He showed her an old plan of the outer wall, the original structure, the collapse, the patchwork repair. "They used whatever they had," he said. "Good stone, bad stone, bricked it over in places. There are pockets, air behind faces, rooms that are almost rooms." He liked the phrase and repeated it, pleased with the shape of it. Almost rooms. In the evening, the weather changed its mind. The fog came early, then left, then returned. A police car touched down the hill road, coasting in neutrality. Olivia watched from the small slit window beside her bed as the officers took a slow round of the grounds, not to bother anyone, just to be seen. She imagined what they saw when they looked up. A building that had not chosen its owners, an American with a name that made land bend around her, a week's worth of quiet that could be read as peace or as plotting. She imagined Daniel seeing the same scene on a news blog and smiling. He would not call her. He had learned that the most effective way to haunt a person is to behave as if they were haunting you. On the fifth morning, the gatekeeper did not appear with coffee. The dog did not show for its self-appointed tour. The fog positioned itself in shelves along the hill, letting her see only what the day wanted her to. She put on a long coat and stepped out alone. The grass along the inner wall slicked the bottoms of her boots. She circled once, then again, making the route that had become familiar. Chapel, orchard, overlook. The little broken archway in the outer wall, where a man her size could slide through sideways and vanish. She stopped at the broken archway, because something in it had shifted. A chunk of stone big enough to skin a shin had fallen, or been levered free. The damp, clean face beneath it was lighter than the rest. She crouched, resting a hand on the old mortar. The archivist's words returned, pockets, almost rooms. She pulled at a tuft of moss, feeling a small, unearned thrill at the idea of finding a secret. It was almost childish. This thing she allowed herself, the fantasy that history had left doors unlocked just for her. She worked at the loosest pieces until her fingers were dirty enough to prove intention. A guilty pleasure, born of a life where others opened things for her. The wall answered with a stone that slid, then another. She could see the cavity now, not big, little more than a crate-sized pocket shored with broken brick. She angled her head, peering in, and felt cold air run across her cheek like an animal moving past. She smelled it before she understood it, that old, coppery, mineral heaviness the body becomes when the world is done with it. She didn't recoil because courage habit cannot learn new tricks. She leaned closer. Something pale lay behind the lip of debris. Fabric first, pale and roped with dirt. Then the shape beneath it, humbling, human, obvious. She had stood beside a body before, in a hospital room with too many machines and only one undeniable silence, but this was different. This was a body that had been taken from light and stored. Olivia put her palm on the wall to steady her breath. She had flown to Europe to escape a headline. She had found a headline sleeping in a castle. She stepped back the way, 1 step back from a cliff they didn't realize they were near. She took out her phone and stared at the bars that came and went like kindness. She had signal enough for a call that would be recorded from the moment it left her mouth. She imagined the timestamp, the dispatch notes. She imagined the local police trying to be the right kind of careful because the caller had a net worth that made people fuss their hair in mirrors. She thumbed the emergency number and pressed call. When she said her name, the dispatcher's tone changed the way men's tones do when they find themselves briefly in the room with a famous person and try to act like rooms are routine. She gave coordinates, described the hole, described the smell, because descriptions of smell cannot be argued. She declined to wait inside. She watched the road until she saw the first lights rise. Not in a hurry, but not strolling either. By noon, there were 3 cars. By 2, some official tape. By dusk, the tripod lamp threw its letter of light against the wall. The dig was not dramatic. It was technical, courteous, apologetic toward Stone. They pulled what they could pull without destroying the story of why it had been placed as it was. When the bracelet came up first, the officers bent around it as if it were a bird that might spook. When the cloth tugged with that reluctance particular to fabric married to wet earth, one officer swore and then apologized to nobody in particular. A dog returned and stood in the mist, head tilted, as if trying to remember which thing he had been warning her about. Olivia stood at a distance that satisfied everybody's sense of propriety and none of her instincts. Her breath came colder than it should have for the temperature. Sets of eyes slid to the side to watch her without being caught. One officer approached with that mix of formality and friendliness people choose when they suspect their words may be read aloud on a witness stand someday. He asked if she had touched anything. She said no, and then amended. The moss, the stone. I'm sorry. He said there would be photographs, and then there were. He asked her to repeat the sequence of her morning, and she did, hearing herself aloud, hearing how the story conspired to sound wrong. She thought, for the first time, of Daniel in earnest. She imagined him learning of this discovery, not from her, but from the world, and she pictured the exact angle at which he would hold his head when he received the news. Slightly down, lids heavy, a listening pose. He would call a friend and not say her name until the 3rd sentence. He would prepare an expression of concern that would be mistaken for grief. He would remind himself, with discipline, not to reach for his phone. The officers found enough to say, with cautious language, that somebody had been placed there deliberately. They did not say when. They did not say who. They did not look at the billionaire who had discovered the grave and think it likely she had built it. But the cameras arrived before dinner, and cameras are allergic to nuance. The bloggers were slicked with satisfaction. The photo of Olivia's daylight smile ran beside grainy shots of the tape in the fog. The caption writers went to work, mashing salacious into solemn. Billionaire CEO stumbles onto secret tomb. Billionaire CEO's eerie find at castle retreat. Billionaire CEO at center of grisly mystery. In the kitchen, late, the gatekeeper poured coffee into a mug that had a cracked lip and handed it over without ceremony. "They'll leave mud inside your house when they're done," she said. "That's what they do. Men who dig. They leave threads of what they've been handling." She wiped a hand on her apron. "You should call your people." Olivia said she would. She did not move to do it. She sipped the coffee and tasted iron. She looked down at the black surface and saw the faint smear of her own face and somebody else's shoulder standing beside her. A trick of shadow on old enamel. She looked up. No shadow lasted. When the officers finally knocked to say they were done for the night, they did not apologize for waking her. They had not woken her. "We'll be back at first light," the sergeant said, a man built of polite lines. "We've secured the site." He used the phrase body recovery without quite letting it out of his mouth. "We'll need statements in the morning. If you're—" He stopped the way people stop in the presence of money, not quite sure if they are addressing the owner of a place or the place that owns the owner. She told him she'd be available. She meant it. In bed, the wind found the slit window again and ran its fingers along the edge of it. The castle did the thing it had been doing all week. It hummed not a noise, a mood. Olivia watched the shadow of a branch on the ceiling move like a needle on a seismograph. She closed her eyes and saw the clean face of the stone where the block had been removed, the white of the lamp against the wall, the way the dirt broke in curls like chocolate when dug. She thought of the dog stopping in that spot, precise, purposeful, every afternoon. She thought of doors that look like walls, and walls that pretend to be doors. She slept badly and woke early, the sort of morning where your name looks like someone else's when you write it. Her phone blinked up at her with an entire night of messages, a board member using diplomacy as a form of panic, a friend who wrote "I love you" in a way that asked for news, 3 journalists who used "Hey Olivia" like they were regulars at the same cafe. She read none of them through. At the bottom of the notifications, there was the anchor that reached through her chest and tugged, a private number with a voice memo attached. She pressed play and heard breathing, then Daniel's voice, unhurried, the tone he used when he believed in the inevitability of his sentences. "Live," he said. "The castle, the wall well. You always did like finding things other people missed. Call me when you can. Or don't. It will be the same either way." She deleted it, and then regretted deleting it, and then regretted the regret. It didn't matter. He would send another. He always did. She dressed in the hardest lines. She had black sweater, dark jeans, boots that matched stone, and walked out to the morning that had not decided whether to rain. Police returned. The archivist returned, invited by someone who wanted context they could place in a report. The dog returned with a stick it hid immediately, as if ashamed of doing ordinary dog things in front of tragedy. They worked. She watched. The bracelets came last, and the cloth came first, and the slow unburdening of the little cavity revealed a truth in spirals. There was a ring in the dirt that wasn't a ring at all, but a wire loop from a cheap bag. There was a leaf skeleton preserved against a cheekbone, and then that cheekbone was a stone that had learned a human shape in the night. The sergeant's face moved through a series of careful rooms. Surprise, calibration, the neutrality men use when they think women are watching for signs. He gave orders. The orders made more officers appear, and the whole became a perimeter. And the perimeter became a story on a dozen phones. News traveled along lines laid down years before. A headline tripped over an ocean and fell into living rooms where the television was always on for company. Billionaire CEO discovers body at castle retreat. Billionaire CEO center of widening investigation. Billionaire CEO questioned by police after grim find. The board group chat burned like a field. Her assistant sent a message that was almost funny in its bland courage. We can still keep the pivot on timeline. Asterisk on the ridge above the outer wall. A drone appeared and hung there, a fat mechanical fly with good eyesight. One officer gestured at it with weary annoyance. Another tried to pretend it was a bird, and a third simply let it in, because the world had already let it in, and closing a gate now was just an exercise. The drone's lens gazed at Olivia for a long second, then wandered to the lamp, the wall, the hole. Somewhere in a tiny apartment, someone zoomed into the image and said, "That's definitely her scarf." And they were right and they were wrong, and the comments still gathered 1,000 hearts. In the early afternoon, a pathologist arrived with a box that looked humble and contained instruments that looked like the future. Olivia stepped further back. She was not squeamish, but she respected distances. The pathologist crouched to the cavity with a practiced patience, then looked up at the sergeant with an expression that said the morning's simple story was done. They spoke in quiet voices. The sergeant straightened. He walked toward Olivia, and then, surprisingly, passed her to the gatekeeper, who had kept herself contained in the doorway of presence all day. "We'll need to expand the search," he said. "There's evidence of more. Not necessarily bodies," he added, careful, like a teacher offering mercy. "Deposits. A history, Miss Hartwell, ma'am. We'll need to ask you to limit your movement on the grounds until we finish the initial phase. For your safety. And for ours." Olivia nodded. Restriction felt almost like relief. A shape of day had been provided. She walked to the far end of the courtyard, where the wind pooled and let it lift the hair from her forehead. She could feel the story thickening around her like wet plaster. She could feel Daniel's attention like a draft under a door. She could feel the castle noticing her, the way a place notices a person who might add a page to its list of names. Her phone rang again, the private number with the tone she recognized in her teeth. She let it ring, watched the drone tilt, watched the officers adjust a tripod, watched the pathologist turn a little object in gloved fingers like someone worrying at a rosary. When the call stopped, she checked the voicemail immediately, hating herself a fraction, but unwilling to pretend his voice again, more composed. The intimacy of a shared language that had been dragged through 10,000 conversations. "The optics are bad," he said softly. "You didn't make them, but you live in them. You should come home. I can make the calls you don't want to." She thought of the photographs of his hands. She thought of the weight those hands had learned in the years with her, carrying things that belonged to her, and then to him, and then to nobody. She thought of the time he painted a room himself because he wanted to understand what it cost to change a color. She remembered loving him for that, briefly. Before it turned into a story, he told about how practical he could be with women like her. The pathologist straightened again, lifting a glance that sliced through the fog. The sergeant's radio crackled with more syllables than a small town usually needs in 1 hour. Someone in the crowd of new arrivals drew in a breath that sounded theatrical to the point of being rude. Olivia did not need to be told what they had found. Not in details, but in direction. Something that made the hole an entrance, and not a container. For the first time since she had dialed the emergency number, The castle felt hostile. Not cruel, not intent, just tired of being misread. The wall looked like a body itself, its stones like vertebrae. The break in it was a wound. She put a hand on the cold and felt it the way one feels the throat of a sleeping animal, checking for the rise of breath. Behind her, a camera shutter learned the rhythm of the lamp's hum and clicked on the beat. And up on the hill, the drone drifted a few feet forward. As if held by a thread in someone's hand, the day would become nights, and then a shape like the one on the thumbnail, the poster, the tape, the pit that was a question, the body that wasn't hers, and then later, the question of hers. The city would learn the castle's name and pronounce it wrong. The market would open 2 points down and then make up its mind. The board would whisper to each other about interim leaders and public statements, and her assistant would bring black clothes to the castle as if grief had a dress code. But on this afternoon, the very first of the long story, Olivia Hartwell did the simplest thing she knew to do. She turned away from all the lenses, found the dog, and scratched behind his ear until his head pushed into her hand and stayed. The dog did not know her name or the number at the end of it. He knew that the wall was wrong and the ground was loud and that the person beside him needed to touch something that had a heart. Behind them, the officers widened the hole by inches, avoiding the urge to rush. The tripod lamp hummed like a lullaby that had forgotten its tune. The fog organized itself into a curtain. Somewhere in the trees, a bird began a repetition that sounded like a code. On the ridge, the drone finally drifted back like a fly losing interest. And in the mouth of the wall in the pocket, in the almost room, the story of what had happened here began, at last. To step forward. Asterisk, the second day of digging began with the smell of wet iron and boiled coffee and a sky the color of a bruise. The pathologist team worked without spectacle, the way people do when they're very aware of what their hands are for. The lamp's beam held steady on the break in the wall, and the fog admitted the morning in bands, not as a single truth. The dog stayed near Olivia, as if he had been hired for the role. He would lie down so his ribs pressed to her boot, and then get up to check the perimeter, tail low, returning each time with a quiet insistence that she remain anchored to something that, Breath. The sergeant asked his questions again for the recorder, and apologized again for the repetition. Olivia answered the way she had answered the night before, word by word, as if placing stones for someone careful to step on. He didn't treat her as an accessory to the scene. He treated her as the person whose shadow would appear behind any future explanation. She found it oddly respectful. He called her Miss Hartwell, and didn't let the name turn into gossip inside his mouth. Asterisk mid-morning, the archivist showed her a photocopy he hadn't planned to share so quickly. It was a ledger page from the late 1800s, one entry scratched out with enviable viciousness. Above it, a note in an impatient hand about irregularities in the south wall. He tapped the margin with a pencil he'd bitten. "This is the section we're in," he said. "There've always been pockets. The families used them. Wars used them. Then the ground used them." She could hear in his voice that more than scholarship was at stake. There was pride, that thin thread that leads people either to great care or to mistakes. She thanked him and watched him blush, relieved to be noticed by someone powerful for something other than the usual reasons. Journalists had taken up positions like perennials. A pair from a tabloid with cheerful umbrellas tried to charm the gatekeeper and got nowhere. A woman in a wool coat made notes on paper, the old way, and nodded when Olivia looked up, as if to say, "I'll do this properly, even if no one reads it." Drones came and went. A tour bus stopped at the foot of the hill and then thought better of it. The castle held still, patient, unwilling to move for cameras. Asterisk, they widened the cavity, and it stopped being a hole and started being a mouth. Behind the first pocket, was a seam of brick laid quickly and wrong. The pathologist worked the edge and whistled, a small happy sound that made the officers smile in spite of themselves. "Segmented," he murmured. "This will open." It did, in pieces, in a slow release of pressure, like an exhale. They found emptiness, and then, inside the emptiness, a shelf made of stone and intention. On the shelf, arrangements. A small tin that once held sweets and now held teeth. A leather strap turned into something useless and black. A woman's comb with a cracked spine. Old things become testimony by being placed together. The sergeant looked over his shoulder toward Olivia, as if checking whether to hide the past on her behalf. She had already seen enough in boardrooms to know that the past never hides. It waits. Asterisk, her phone hummed like a trapped insect. She let it. The board wrote in group sentences that had no verbs. Optics, flight home, counsel, stay silent. Her assistant, brave as always, delivered the single sentence in the stack that sounded like care and not panic. "Tell me if you want me there." Olivia typed no, then yes, then stopped because any answer made the day heavier. She put the phone in her pocket and watched the pathologist remove an object with the tender. Economy reserved for infants and bombs. It was a brooch shaped like a small nest, recent enough to look like it came from a boutique that hired poets to name their medals. She knew it because she had sent it to a woman she loved like a sister last February. On the underside was a hair, looped, a color she recognized as her own. The pathologist placed it in a tray. The sergeant leaned in. "Got yours?" he asked softly. She shook her head and then surprised herself by saying, "That design is mine, actually. We gave them to keynote speakers at the Phoenix Summit. 200 made." She could feel the world arrange that sentence into a reason to suspect, but the sergeant only wrote it down the way a farmer notes weather. Asterisk, by noon, the story had matured into cruelty. A studio show ran a chyron that pretended to be a question. Did her company's gifts connect her to a decades-old grave? A podcaster rehearsed apologies between segments and then didn't use them. A photo of Olivia at 16, holding a trophy, circulated beside a photo of the whole. The internet's favorite magic trick. See, she's been practicing burial since she was a child. She breathed and did not look. She watched the wall, which did not ask to be watched, and she kept her hands inside her coat so they didn't get ideas. The gatekeeper brought soup, thin and hot. We used to tell children the south wall was where the old soldiers hid their fear, she said, putting down the thermos with a clack, as if fear were a thing you could stack like wood. My nan said that if you built rooms for it, fear would pay rent. If you didn't, it would live with you for free. She looked at the officers with a curiosity that had no malice in it, only inventory. "They'll be here days," she said, "and in your head for weeks." The archivist found a mention of smuggling in a notebook from a rector with poor spelling but bright eyes. He explained it all in a tone too excited for a place with a body. During the wars and after spirits, jewelry, people. The south wall became a habit. This isn't a graveyard exactly. It's a habit. He seemed to realize how ugly the sentence sounded and stepped back from it, muttering apologies to the stones. Mid-afternoon. A car made the hill with the sort of efficiency that suggests its driver believes roads should move out of his way. The officers glanced without glancing. Olivia felt the change in her breath before she knew why, and then she knew why. The privacy glass. The paint the color of money. The driver, who was already opening the rear door as if the body about to emerge were sacred. Daniel stepped out with a scarf wrapped like a sentence that wouldn't end. He had the expression he had practiced concern, unmarred by hope and the posture. That said, a skeleton under any suit exists to be admired. A small crew of cameras who had anticipated this entrance lifted their lenses as one. The dog stood and tucked himself behind Olivia's legs with the clarity of a child who knows which parent means safety and which means rules. He didn't approach her first. He never did. He approached the sergeant and offered a hand and a compliment about procedure. He said he would be staying at a hotel that had 6 fewer rooms than he needed. He said he had no comment, and then commented briefly on how sad it all was. When he turned at last toward Olivia, he let his mouth soften as if he had just remembered they had once shared a bed. "You shouldn't be here," she said, which was an honest sentence that could be read as love or as law. "I was worried," he said, which was not the same as I am worried now. He tilted his head at the cavity as if appraising a sculpture. "You always did find the seam." He had learned that she did not reward the first line. He waited to be asked a second question, and she did not ask. The sergeant, to his credit, interrupted the choreography by asking Daniel where he'd been the last 24 hours and where he intended to be the next 24. Daniel answered with the elegance of a man who'd had a lawyer feed him breakfast. The words landed in the air between them and made a neat fence. Olivia felt absurdly grateful for the fence. She could stand and not be touched. He stayed, because leaving would have looked like something. He placed himself at a remove that read as respect to the cameras and as possession to anyone who knew him. He made calls exactly where people could see him making calls. He said her name into a phone twice, in a way that sounded like he was explaining the address of a house. Fire to a child. The pathologist's team lifted something heavier. The lamp brightened to compensate. The fog thinned. They had found the rest of the shelf and the end of the almost room. No more bones than a single person's, and those not complete. The sergeant's shoulders told Olivia what the report would say. Female, likely, age indistinct. Decades old, likely. Not recent. The brooch introduced a modern cruelty, but did not change the main arithmetic. This was a woman no one had looked for loudly enough. The cameras retreated in boredom when the words not recent started making their way down the hill. Headlines don't like patience. Overnight rooms canceled their bookings. The studio show found a new, fresher grief. The podcaster issued the apology he had practiced and let the algorithm eat it. By sundown, the hill wore quiet again, and the tape fluttered in the kind of wind that makes expression out of nothing. For the first time since the hole opened, Olivia felt the weight of what was left when spectacle goes. It was simply her, and the officers, and the wall. The archivist wrapped his photocopies in twine with a care that made her want to give him money just to watch him tie knots. The gatekeeper locked a door she had not locked in a decade. The dog barked once into a pocket of air and then seemed to apologize. Lying down with his face on his paws as if he'd said too much, she walked the long gallery alone before bed. The one with portraits of men who wore their victories on their sleeves and women who wore their victories where no one could paint them. She paused at a face she partly recognized because every portraitist has one woman. They can't stop painting under different names. The oil had darkened to that tobacco color old art gets when a century makes itself comfortable. Olivia leaned in until she could smell varnish. The woman stared past her, as if watching for someone late to dinner by a century dot. There are men who believe silence is a resource they own. Daniel was one of them. When her phone rang near midnight, it did not startle her. It was part of the weather. She let it go once, then twice, then caught it on the third, so he would lose the rhythm he wanted. She said hello and heard nothing for a breath, and then his voice, pitched lower, the register he saved for statements dressed as questions. "How close are you to the wall right now?" She looked at the slit window, at the spill of lamplight on stone. "Down the gallery," she said, more to see what he would do with the information than because it was his to have. "You should go back to your room," he said, with the ease of a man telling someone to take an umbrella because rain is inevitable. "This is not a night for wandering." "What do you know about this night?" she asked. The dog lifted his head, listening to the watch in her voice. A small exhale. "The same as anyone with a working internet connection and friends on your board," he said lightly. "And more than they do, because I know you. You don't run when it looks like this. You go closer." He left the sentence unadorned, as if his omniscience were a kindness. She thought of all the times she had rewarded him for that tone, because it felt like love. She hung up without answering. It's hard to do to someone who has used your attention as currency, and it felt like throwing a coin into a lake. She breathed, walked back to her room, watched her own reflection in the window shiver, and reassemble as a draft found a crack. On the small table near the bed lay the scarf she'd worn the day she arrived, folded the way you fold something when you don't trust it to hold a crease. She didn't remember folding it. That would have been her assistant's tidiness, or her own if she'd wanted the pretense of control. She touched the fabric and felt the static of winter climb her wrist. Something slippery in her body, fear or intuition, took hold. She lifted the scarf and found the smallest wrong beneath it, a slip of paper, torn. The edge of a photograph dot. She turned it over and saw the castle's south wall from a slightly different angle than any of the cameras had found. It was a point of view from inside the grounds, a day before anyone had cut the tape. In the lower left corner of the image, a bare patch where grass had been pressed down by a knee. Written on the back, in a hand that did not belong to Daniel and did not belong to anyone she knew. A simple arithmetic. One of two. Her body did what intelligent bodies do when a private message arrives in a place that should not host messages. It made a plan before her mind could propose options. She locked the door, set the chair, checked the second lock, as if locks were guarantees. She texted the sergeant a sentence without context. "Did anyone on your team take photographs from inside the South Garden yesterday afternoon, before the perimeter was up?" He didn't answer immediately, because men who sleep in their uniforms find sleep when they can. She texted her assistant 2 words, "Call me," and then deleted them because she couldn't explain what she needed, yet ***. The dog slept against the door. The wind took a breath. Somewhere below, a hinge complained. She turned off the light and watched the rectangle of the window, and the thinner rectangle within it, with a slit opened onto the night. From the fog outside came a rhythm that could have been a branch, or could have been the step of someone careful. She didn't move. She let the castle talk to itself. She waited for the next card to be turned at dawn, when she had not slept and the dog had only pretended to. An officer knocked with the deliberate politeness used to avoid making bad decisions. She let him in and showed the photograph, and watched the muscles of his face do that series of rooms again. He said he'd get the sergeant. He said she should sit. She did not. Toward mid-morning, a second photograph arrived in a plain envelope slid under her door, which would have been a cliché if not for the way the envelope had come through a slit. No envelope could travel cleanly. It had been folded and refolded and smoothed again. On the front, nothing written. Inside, an image of the chapel door at night, and a shadow that could be anybody's. On the back, 2 of 2, and a line that made the room tilt. Don't make them search the wrong wall. She felt the map in her head adjust, the way a city's lights shift after a power cut. The archivist's words pockets, almost runes, came rushing back as if someone had paid them to. The south wall had been the obvious place, because the whole had offered itself like a confession. The chapel was a quieter mouth with better manners. She looked at the photograph until the grain turned into a landscape. She saw the way the mortar bowed near the doorframe, like a bruise blooming beneath skin. She saw, or believed she saw, the faint, unmathematical seam where a repair ended and a story began. She walked to the chapel in daylight, 2 officers with her in the posture of escorts and also of witnesses. The gatekeeper met them with a keyring and eyes that held too many centuries. "Don't touch what you don't want remembering you," she said as she turned the lock. The air tasted like beeswax and last year's flowers. The light came in sideways and made the dust look organized dot at the doorframe. Lower left, where a knee might rest if someone loved prayer more than their joints. The mortar had a different opinion about pressure. Olivia crouched where she had crouched the day before, set her fingers on stone that had held the heat of more hands than she could count, and felt it. A draft that spoke. She stood too quickly, and the world pinwheeled. That dark, bright rush of standing up in rooms where history has opinions. "Here," she said, and the officers didn't ask how she knew. They called for the pathologist, for the sergeant, for the lamp. The tripod hummed again as someone carried it in like a guest of honor. The light made the scene an accusation. The dog lay down with his chin flat on the stone and watched. The door the way dogs watch a hole in a fence they understand better than you do. Daniel stood in the courtyard with his scarf and his plan and looked toward the chapel with the intentness of a man watching a slot machine he'd fed his last coin. On his phone, unseen to her, a message blinked unanswered from a number he recognized but did not save. He had thought his shadow could do the panicking for him. He had not planned for a wall that knew more of him than any person did. They began the work again, careful as surgeons, rude as truth. The first stone came free with an old sigh, and cold air rolled out like news. The lamp's beam reached in and found not a shelf, but a void deeper than the first, a space too deliberate to be accident. The archivist made a helpless sound because awe and horror share a single throat. The sergeant set his mouth the way men do when they're about to call a thing by its true name, not in the first 30 seconds. They found nothing but air. In the next 30, the light found something that glimmered, not metal exactly, not jewelry, something modern pretending to be old in a place old enough to be angry at the pretense. The pathologist leaned in and lifted it with forceps and held it up with a frown. It was a tiny black disc the size of a coin, pitted with dirt, and anyone with a certain sort of life knew it at once. A tracker, not on, not broadcasting, dead of battery or killed on purpose. Olivia's breath did something painful and unhelpful. Her name on a half-dozen phones became a new kind of sentence. It's not just an accident of history. Someone had been here with purpose, recently enough to bring batteries, bold enough to leave messages that folded like origami into her room. She did not think it through so much as feel the shape of it in her chest. Someone had been mapping her castle for her, and not for her benefit. The dog stood. Outside, the fog retreated to watch from the trees. Inside, the lamp hummed, and the officers eased the next stone, and the next, until the door in the wall remembered it had once been a door and stepped aside. The light reached into a space that accepted it reluctantly, and then, when it had had enough, offered something back. On the floor of the cavity lay a single object that did not belong to the century, or to the chapel, or to any previous story the wall had told. A phone case the exact shade of olive that Olivia's assistant insisted made her eyes look kinder, stamped with the small blind embossed emblem of her company, and, near the corner where a thumb always rests, a smear of mud that was not yet dry. Asterisk, the phone case sat in the tray like a dare, ordinary and intimate in a room that had run out of ordinary. The sergeant didn't touch it until the pathologist nodded. Then he lifted it with 2 fingers and held it to the light. The emblem caught and through the lamp's beam, her company's compass mark, the one she had drawn on napkins for a year before. A designer cleaned it up, and the world pretended it had always looked that way. The smear at the corner was still tacky enough to change shape under breath. "Is that yours?" the sergeant asked, already knowing the answer. "Yes," she said, and felt the room lean in. "The phone isn't, just the case. I have 3. I rotate them. It was the sort of detail that delighted an algorithm and bored a judge. The sergeant nodded, as if she had told him the wind's last name. "When did you last have it on your phone?" "A week ago," she said, because she remembered losing patience with a scratch on the quarter and replacing it with one her assistant had in a drawer. "In the city. Before I flew." He nodded once more, wrote it down, and then said the thing that had to be said: "Chain of custody, evidence, tests." She stood very still and did not look at Daniel. He didn't say a word. He had trained for that, too. There are moments you cannot improve and can only contaminate. They searched the cavity and found nothing else modern. A rusted hinge that let go like a tooth. A coin whose king had been flat, hammered into anonymity. The phone case, absurd and exact, was the only thing that belonged to this decade. It sat in its tray and made the chapel feel like a pocket turned out. Out in the courtyard, the dog discovered a new joy in chasing his own breath. He'd run a few steps, stop, and sneeze at the air as if it had insulted him. The gatekeeper watched him and muttered, "He knows when a hole is a door." She handed Olivia a towel for her hands, as if she had been sculpting and needed to return to being human. "You can tell a story by the way the walls let go," she said. "Quick is panic. Slow is confession. This one is pride. Whoever opened it last wanted it remembered." The archivist, pale with the thrill of proximity to relevance, held the tracker delicately with forceps while a young officer bagged it. "Commercial model," he said, too fast, eager to be useful. "Cheap. You can buy a dozen for the price of a good lunch." He realized he sounded like a catalog and flushed. "Sorry, I've had students use them to follow foxes." The sergeant took all of it in, made a shape in his notes, and assigned a quiet man to pull the chapel door entirely off its hinges. The man did it in 3 deliberate motions, and laid the door gently along the pews as if it were heavy with names. Another officer stood at the chapel entrance and marked a list on a clipboard. Who had gone in? Who had come out? What hour the wall had declared its new facts. Asterisk Daniel made himself a shadow at the edge of every frame. He didn't speak to Olivia, but he performed concern like a ritual. When a camera turned his way, he looked toward the chapel and then away, a choreography that made him appear protective without being proprietary. He had always understood where to put his hands in a room. He kept them visible, empty, eloquent. He didn't look at the phone case at all, which was, of course, a way of looking that by late afternoon. The weather remembered it was a hill and behaved like one. Rain assembling in that fine, mean way that makes umbrellas ridiculous. The officers spread tarps where tarps would not insult evidence. The lamp glowed more bravely in the gray. The drone returned and sulked along the ridge, unhappy with the wet, but still obedient to its operator's wish to be a witness. The sergeant asked Olivia to come to the temporary tent that had become an office. He gestured to a chair, and she remained standing because she didn't want to be smaller. He laid 2 photographs side by side on the table, the south wall cavity open, the chapel cavity opening. He placed the phone case between them, and then, last, the 2 paper photos that had been slipped under her door. "Someone is curating your days," he said mildly. "They like narrative." She wanted to laugh, because it was exactly the sort of assessment she would have given in a boardroom, down to the word choice. "How did they get into my room?" She asked instead. "We'll answer that before we leave," he said, which was not the same as "I can answer it now." "The gatekeeper says the doors are loyal." She's right. But walls have opinions too, and this place has too many opinions for my liking. "Is there anyone you have not told me about who would have access? Personal security? Discreet staff? A friend who knows how to be a shadow?" Asterisk, she thought through the list and found it short. Fame had conditioned her to hire people who signed papers, promising never to be interesting. "No one here with me," she said. "At home, yes. Not here." He kept his voice soft. "The man outside," he said, not giving Daniel a name. "He knows her habits." The phone case sat in the tray like a dare, ordinary and intimate, in a room that had run out of ordinary. The sergeant didn't touch it until the pathologist nodded. Then he lifted it with 2 fingers and held it to the light. The emblem caught and through the lamp's beam. Her company's compass mark, the one she had drawn on napkins for a year before. A designer cleaned it up, and the world pretended it had always looked that way. The smear at the corner was still tacky enough to change shape under breath. "Is that yours?" the sergeant asked, already knowing the answer. "Yes," she said, and felt the room lean in. "The phone isn't, just the case. I have 3. I rotate them." It was the sort of detail that delighted an algorithm and bored a judge. The sergeant nodded as if she had told him the wind's last name. "When did you last have it on your phone?" "A week ago," she said, because she remembered losing patience with a scratch on the corner and replacing it with one her assistant had in a drawer. "In the city. Before I flew." He nodded once more, wrote it down, and then said the thing that had to be said. Chain of custody, evidence, tests. She stood very still and did not look at Daniel. He didn't say a word. He had trained for that, too. There are moments you cannot improve and can only contaminate. They searched the cavity and found nothing else modern. A rusted hinge that let go like a tooth. A coin whose king had been flat hammered into anonymity. The phone case, absurd and exact, was the only thing that belonged to this decade. It sat in its tray and made the chapel feel like a pocket turned out. Out in the courtyard, the dog discovered a new joy in chasing his own breath. He'd run a few steps, stop, and sneeze at the air as if it had insulted him. The gatekeeper watched him and muttered, "He knows when a hole is a door." She handed Olivia a towel for her hands, as if she had been sculpting and needed to return to being human. "You can tell a story by the way the walls let go," she said. "Quick is panic. Slow is confession. This one is pride. Whoever opened it last wanted it remembered." The archivist, pale with the thrill of proximity to relevance, held the tracker delicately with forceps while a young officer bagged it. "Commercial model," he said, too fast, eager to be useful. "Cheap. You can buy a dozen for the price of a good lunch." He realized he sounded like a catalog and flushed. "Sorry, I've had students use them to follow foxes." The sergeant took all of it in, made a shape in his notes, and assigned a quiet man to pull the chapel door entirely off its hinges. The man did it in 3 deliberate motions and laid the door gently along the pews as if it were heavy with names. Another officer stood at the chapel entrance and marked a list on a clipboard. Who had gone in? Who had come out? What hour the wall had declared its new facts. Daniel made himself a shadow at the edge of every frame. He didn't speak to Olivia, but he performed concern like a ritual. When a camera turned his way, he looked toward the chapel and then away, a choreography that made him appear protective without being proprietary. He had always understood where to put his hands in a room. He kept them visible, empty, eloquent. He didn't look at the phone case at all, which was, of course, a way of looking by late afternoon. The weather remembered it was a hill and behaved like one. Rain assembling in that fine, mean way that makes umbrellas ridiculous. The officers spread tarps where tarps would not insult evidence. The lamp glowed more bravely in the gray. The drone returned and sulked along the ridge, unhappy with the wet, but still obedient to its operator's wish to be a witness. The sergeant asked Olivia to come to the temporary tent that had become an office. He gestured to a chair, and she remained standing because she didn't want to be smaller. He laid 2 photographs side by side on the table, the south wall cavity open. The chapel cavity opening. He placed the phone case between them, and then, last, the 2 paper photos that had been slipped under her door. "Someone is curating your days," he said mildly. "They like narrative." She wanted to laugh, because it was exactly the sort of assessment she would have given in a boardroom, down to the word choice. "How did they get into my room?" She asked instead. "We'll answer that before we leave," he said, which was not the same as I can answer it now. "The gatekeeper says the doors are loyal." She's right. But walls have opinions too, and this place has too many opinions for my liking. "Is there anyone you have not told me about who would have access? Personal security? Discreet staff? A friend who knows how to be a shadow?" She thought through the list and found it short. Fame had conditioned her to hire people who signed papers, promising never to be interesting. "No one here with me," she said. "At home, yes. Not here." He kept his voice soft. "The man outside," he said, not giving Daniel a name. "He knows your habits." "He knows what he wants my habits to be," she said, more sharply than she intended. "That's not the same." "Not for me to say," the sergeant replied, and she liked him for it. "We'll ask him for his phone for a voluntary look. If he refuses, we'll find other ways." "He will refuse," she said. "He enjoys refusing." The sergeant folded the photographs and slid them into a folder with the sort of respect that keeps paper from becoming something else. "Then we'll do it the old way," he said. "Feet, questions time." When she stepped back into the wet, the castle's outline had vanished into the weather. Only the lamp drew a clean geometry on the wall. Daniel stood with his scarf now dark and damp, as elegant in discomfort as he was in comfort. He caught her eye without asking permission and moved a half-step closer. "You always did know how to keep attention where you were," he said softly. A compliment that had learned to be a blade. "You always did know how to follow it," she replied, which sounded like flirtation if heard from far away. Up close, it wasn't. He lifted his hands. "I'm here to help," he said, a sentence that had excused 1,000 interferences. "They're going to look at you, Olivia. It isn't fair, but it's natural." The optics, she repeated, and the word felt like a stone in her mouth. "Do you practice saying that in a mirror, or do you still prefer the black screen?" His smile flickered, brief as a moth. "I practice on people who think words can be undone by tone," he said. "Come home. We can control this from there." She looked at the chapel. "I won't leave while they're finding answers in a house I paid to borrow," she said. "I'm not afraid of being a witness." "You should be," he said, not unkindly. He had that gift. He could use the cadence of tenderness to move furniture around in your life. Witnesses become stories when the story runs out of bodies. The dog cut across the conversation by shaking rain from his fur with the enthusiastic violence of a creature made entirely of the present. It forced them both to step back. The moment broke. Daniel took out his phone and pretended to be interested in a text. Olivia let him have the pretense and walked away at dusk. The pathologist called a halt. The chapel cavity would be protected overnight, instruments covered, door off, perimeter set. The sergeant arranged for 2 officers to sleep where pews had hosted weddings and funerals. The gatekeeper cleaned the aisle with a broom that had been new when Olivia was in high school. The dog refused to enter, setting his paws at the threshold like a sailor respecting a rail in bad weather. "He doesn't go where the quiet isn't tired yet," the gatekeeper said. The sentence sounded borrowed from a grandparent. It landed in Olivia's chest as if it had been waiting for a home. She ate bread and cheese and a pear that tasted like September. Her assistant finally reached her on a clean line and spoke in the tone you use for airplanes and turbulence. "Facts, checklists, what can be controlled." "I sent a replacement team to New York," the assistant said. "The keynote is now a fireside chat, and the fireside is a lawyer. Everyone is calling it postponement, not cancellation. The board wants your video. I told them we will not film grief. Thank you, Olivia said, and felt the particular relief of someone having the argument you cannot bear to in your name. There's something else, she added, and described the photographs. The assistant listened with the sort of silence that lets information settle into the same drawer as breathing. Who would do that? She asked finally, and it wasn't a question that expected an answer. I'll make a list, she said, and Olivia wanted to cry, because she knew it would be an accurate list, and she would hate reading it. Night closed the hill like a door. The officers' radios muttered, their voices softened by stone. A generator throbbed near the tape and added a human heartbeat to the weather. The lamp in the chapel hummed, and then, on a timer the technician hadn't disclosed, clicked off. The darkness that arrived had discipline. Olivia stood with her hand on the wall and counted to a number larger than comfort and smaller than superstition. Nothing moved that shouldn't. She should have slept. She didn't. She walked a little, not far, keeping to paths the dogs seemed to approve. The orchard held shapes that pretended to be people until you told them to stop. She did not look toward the ridge, where cameras sometimes slept like foxes. She kept near the outer wall, where the short grass remembered a time when hooves meant urgency. The rain had softened to a syllabus. When she returned to the south wall, the tape fluttered, and the whole looked sullen rather than hungry. She crouched without crossing the line and studied the dirt the way a person studies a lover's face in the dark, by outline and guess. A small stone near the edge had been turned, so its pale underside showed, and she reached for it with the tip of a stick, a child's trick. Under the stone, bare earth, and in the earth, the corner of a plastic bag, blacker than the mud. She glanced over her shoulder out of a reflex she didn't know she'd kept. The nearest officer was at the tent, speaking into a radio and writing, back turned. The dog's ears lifted, then flattened, as if he'd heard an argument between two things, and decided to avoid taking sides. Olivia reached under the tape and hooked the bag with the stick and coaxed it gently out. It resisted like something being born. She didn't break the seal. She didn't even brush the mud off fully. She held it up by the top edge and let the rain do the cleaning dot inside, layered carefully as if packed by a museum intern. Were 3 things? A thin notebook, the cheap kind you buy in stacks. A hotel key card from a brand that prided itself on clean fonts. And a photograph of Olivia with Daniel, taken 3 years earlier in a restaurant, where waiters wore sneakers so they could move without noise. On the back of the photograph, the same hand as before had written, "It started here." She didn't open the notebook. She put the bag back where she'd found it, pressing the stone over the dirt, restoring the face the wall wanted the world to see. She straightened slowly, feeling each vertebra complain. She wiped the stick clean on the grass and slid it under the tape like a confession. Then she walked to the tent and said to the sergeant very clearly, because clarity is a language police understand, "There is a package under the lip of the south cavity. I did not open it. Please come now." He moved with a speed that didn't look like speed, because he didn't waste any of it on dramatics. He lifted the stone, bagged the bag, and met her eyes with a look that was both gratitude and rebuke. "You shouldn't have touched that," he said gently. "I didn't," she lied without guilt, because the difference between a stick and a hand mattered to nobody who would be reading this later, and because sometimes being believed is a luxury you cannot afford. He nodded as if he'd heard the truth anyway, and they took the package into a light and a clean table and a pair of new gloves. The notebook was full of the neat, square handwriting of someone who learned letters to impress a teacher. It contained dates, locations, times, and short nouns that meant more to the writer than they did to the reader. Gate, white car, lunchbox, choir. A little map of the castle grounds appeared in the back, drawn with the severe seriousness of a child making a treasure chart. 2 X's marked the south wall and the chapel. A third X, uncomfortably, marked the cliffside by the overlook where couples carved hearts into bark on weekends. The hotel key card was from a place 40 minutes away, stamped with the dates of last week. The photograph of Olivia with Daniel held them in a moment she would have sworn she had never posed for, her head cocked at an angle she didn't like. His hand on the table near hers, but not on it. A bouquet in the background already wilting into honesty. She turned it over in the bag with a gloved hand. The writing stared back. It started here. Where is here? The sergeant asked, not because he couldn't see the restaurant's trademark tile in the corner of the image, but because he needed her to say it. She did. She told him the name. She told him the city. She told him the year. She did not tell him what had started there because she didn't know, or because she knew and couldn't stand to hear it aloud in a tent on a wet hill beside a wall that had been keeping secrets longer than her. Grandparents had been alive. He said they'd get the key card read. He said they'd get the notebook copied. He said a lot of things that meant men and women would now start walking into other rooms with polite questions and leave. Those rooms with the heaviness that follows answers. He said she should sleep. She nodded in agreement with a plan her body had already vetoed. The dog escorted her to the suite as if earning his keep. The corridor had the feeling of a theater after a show. Props left where the light wouldn't trip on them. In her room, she found nothing on the table, nothing under the scarf, nothing under the bed. She laughed once, a small dry sound that smelled like old paper. She locked the door and placed the chair and lay down with her boots still on because this was not a night for ceremony. Somewhere between awake and asleep, the castle did what old buildings do for those they have accepted. It let the past move just close enough to touch. She dreamed not in pictures, but in temperatures. The cold of stone on her palm, the warm push of the dog's shoulder against her shin. The heat the phone case must have held from someone's pocket not long before it slid into the wall. She woke to a silence so complete it had 2 parts. The generator had cut. The lamp was off. The radios had quieted as if told a story and then asked to hold their breath. She sat up, the room a shape of black against black. The dog lifted his head and made a low sound that was not a growl and not a growl. She turned her phone face down and waited. The castle breathed. The corridor breathed back. A step on stone, a careful one, and then another. Not stealthy enough to be practiced, not careless enough to be innocent. She stood, moved to the door, and placed her ear where the wood remembered shoulders. The step paused on the other side, as if listening to the same door from the opposite world. A soft, unmistakable sigh, and then the paper-thin scrape of something sliding along the floor. Asterisk, the paper slid, hesitated against the rug, and stopped with a soft sigh. She waited until the step retreated. 2, 3. A pause as if the person were listening for her hand on the knob, and then she flicked on the lamp. Low, the way divers bring light to their masks, and not the ocean. The dog stood without noise, his tail a question he didn't ask Dot. She nudged the paper with her boot. No envelope this time. 1 sentence written in the same square hand as the numbered photographs. The third X is a door. Come Alone. Her body considered the command and answered with the ancient intelligence it had been saving for just such an order. Tell the sergeant. She lifted her phone, typed exactly what she saw, added the photograph of the note for his time-stamped world, and then, because dignity isn't always a virtue, wrote, "Pretend I didn't," a double tap of delivered blue. No reply. The generator coughed awake. The hallway took its breath again. She put on her coat and did not put on her shoes. She held them in one hand. The dog gave her a look she would later translate as a contract. If you are foolish, be quick about it. She opened the door to the corridor and saw nothing but the corridor. She moved down it the way you move down a hotel hallway at 3:12 a.m., becoming an idea rather than a person. At the turn, she slipped into the stairwell and stood for a count of 30. Nobody followed. The dog leaned into her shin as if to steady her. She crossed the courtyard under a sky the rain had brushed with its sleeve. The officers were silhouettes with murmuring radios at the chapel and the tent. The south wall slept with its lamp off, sullen now, the way old wounds are when new ones arrive. She went toward the overlook toward the third X, on the back of the notebook feeling. The hill dropped under her feet in cautious half-steps. The grass there was slick as scalp. The overlook wasn't the cliff the brochures loved, but a shoulder of earth where couples carved initials and teenagers tried cigarettes. A place for the castle to lean out and look at itself reflected in the valley. There was an old well, lid newer than its stones, chained like a bicycle in a suspicious neighborhood. The chain had been cut. She saw it, bright as a confession. The links laid back the way a careful child lays back blankets to make a bed again after a nightmare. She stopped 5 paces away because you don't step over thresholds with a stranger's instructions in your hand. She raised her phone, pointed it at the dark circle of the well, and let the video run because she believed in evidence more than she believed in luck. She said low, "This is Olivia Hartwell, not for drama but for later." A shape detached from the well's shadow. Not from within it, but beside it, the way a sentence emerges from parentheses. Daniel. Coat dark with the small rain. Scarf gone. Hair damp as if the weather had brushed it with approval. He did not look surprised to see her. He looked weary, which was how he preferred other people to see his cruelty. "You came alone," he said quietly, pleased with the echo of control in the phrase. "I didn't," she said. "You just can't see who I brought yet." He smiled without teeth. "You always did misunderstand what alone means," he said. "It isn't about company. It's about leverage." He lifted his hands to show he was empty. His left sleeve tugged back an inch. Mud darkened the cuff, not with spray, but with touch, the way hands pick up soil when they have been lifting stone. He took 2 steps toward her, or toward the phone toward the lens that could make him a monster, or a man, and then stopped because the dog's growl braided itself into the night and made it thicker. "You sent the photographs," she said. "Not a question. You put the case in the chapel. You wanted a story with my name in its spine." He tilted his head the way he had the first time they disagreed with Grace. "You were already the story," he said. "I only gave it structure." "For what?" she asked. "To scare me home? To sell a version of me more convenient for you to rescue on television." His laugh was an exhale. "To keep you predictable," he said. "You scare investors. You forget that your courage looks like chaos to people holding retirement accounts. The pivot will kill your company if you do it as if you were poor." He glanced at the well's rim, then away, practiced. "Fear is a tool, Liv. It's a lock you know the combination to." "I borrowed it." Behind him, near the path, a radio crackled, once an officer clearing his throat into plastic, and Daniel's eyes flicked toward it in that betrayed, animal way. He calculated the distance to retreat and the distance to charm. He chose charm because it had paid for his cars. "Walk back with me," he said, softness pouring over steel. "We'll say we found the chain. We'll say you called me because you were afraid, and I arrived, and the optics will behave. I'll sit with the sergeant and talk about trackers in the abstract. The board will see your humility. The market will forgive the castle. And this place will go back to being a stone in bad weather." Olivia moved her phone an inch so the well sat in the frame's left edge. "You cut the chain," she said. His smile didn't falter. "Someone did," he said. "A person who wanted to rewrite the image of you standing beside a grave. A person who understands cameras." The radio on the path crackled again, closer. The respective men who understood that fear, like wildlife, spooked if you ran at it. Daniel measured the math a second time and found it worse. He took a small, precise step forward, the kind you take when you intend to take 3 more after it. The dog lunged first not to bite, but to make a shape of space Daniel did not own. He flinched. The flinch wasn't theatrical. He reached to steady himself, and his hand found the well's rim, and in that graceless moment, his wrist smudged the mud on the stone into a recognizable print. He drew his hand back, saw what he'd left, and understood the arithmetic of it. The look he gave her then was not hatred. It was contempt that had run out of uses. "You never learn when to stop," he said, and there was no softness left in him. "You don't understand that some doors exist, remain closed. Then why did you open them?" she asked. The officers stepped onto the overlook quietly enough that no one pretended surprise. The sergeant said Daniel's name for the first time, as if reading it from a card handed to him by an impartial god. He didn't say anything else. He didn't have to. He looked at the chain. He looked at the mud. He looked at Olivia's phone, still held up, still recording a hill that had run out of patience. For a second, the scene balanced on a knife so fine it made no line. Daniel could have raised his hands and performed surrender. He could have stepped back, practiced contrition, hired men who speak to juries like fathers at kitchen tables, and lived to haunt boardrooms. Instead, he reached for the phone, not for her, for the lens, to erase the tape he hadn't made. The instinct was so pure it outpaced training. He grabbed. The dog barked the way thunder barks back at storms. Olivia's elbow knocked against the rim, and the phone skipped from her hand and clapped, once against the well's stone before sliding into the opening like a coin. There was no cinematic pause. The officers moved with the embarrassment of men who had hoped not to be needed. Hands took hands. The chain clinked in a way that registered in her bones as finality. Daniel's breath came up harsh and humiliating, like a runner's on a bad day. The sergeant's voice lowered and spread its authority over the scene until even the night felt deputized. They did not find a body in the well that night. They found cold air, and the shaft's old complaint had an echo that came back too, quickly, because the well had been lined with stone to keep it honest. They lowered a lamp that made the dark into an idea you could name and sent down a camera on a cable that wobbled like a new foal. It saw 3 meters of throat and then bricks where a previous century had decided water was less useful than secrecy. No space for a person yet. No grave. Not here. Daniel went to a car with a man on each side of him and performed cooperation with shoulders set to a reasonable width. He did not look back at Olivia, which was a look back of its own. The dog panted as if he had lived a full life in an hour. The sergeant finally let the word arrest into the air. Not for murder, not yet, but for obstruction and interference, and the simple indecency of playing architect. Inside an open investigation, the rest moved like paperwork disguised as days. The tracker's purchase traced to a burner. Email paid by a card that paid for a hotel room that viewed the castle from a hill the way a hunter views a field. The notebook's neat nouns cross-referenced with CCTV that showed Daniel arriving and leaving when he had claimed to be somewhere else. The cut chain matched the bolt cutters lifted from his trunk. Blades nicked in a way blades memorize. Lawyers arrived and put their expensive bodies between statements and consequences. The castle stayed where it had been, unimpressed. What they did not have, even as dawns turned and headlines lost patience, was Olivia herself. Asterisk. She lasted in the world precisely long enough to shake the hand of the officer who handled the phone retrieved from the well's shelf the next morning, caught in the stack above the old brick, spared by inches and a lip in the stone. The footage from the hour between note and confrontation was there, her voice calm and low, the chain, the mud, the hand. She watched it with the sergeant in the tent, both of them leaning in. The way people watch themselves sleep on security footage, unnerved by how like and unlike they are to their imaginations. After, she walked the orchard once with the dog. The fog behaved. The castle hummed its neutral hum. She called her assistant and said, "Send the statement." Not the video yet. Words first, then images. She hung up and stood at the chapel door, because habit is how we pretend we can re-enter hours that have ended. The lamp was off. The void was sealed again with boards and tape and the slow bureaucracy of respect. Somewhere between chapel and suite, she vanished, not into romantic mist, not into an edit, into a seam. A place a person could stand and not be seen by the cameras mounted, because everyone assumes danger travels on straight lines. The gatekeeper would later swear she heard a hinge soft, the way a kitchen cabinet closes in a house where people love one another. The dog howled once and then went to ground, nose flat to stone, pawing at nothing. Ears pinned as if scolded by the air. They found her 2 days later because the archivist could not let go of the phrase almost rooms. He brought a thermal camera no one had asked him to bring and walked the inner corridor in squares. At a place where the wall bowed out and then back, as if inhaling and deciding to be polite about it, the screen showed a rectangle cooler than the stones around it. Behind that rectangle, a pocket. Behind the pocket, a drop, an oubliette, tidy as a banker's ledger, deep enough to keep a secret and shallow enough to keep hope alive too long. There was no story left for theatrics. The boards came down. The stones came out. A ladder went in. The dog whined the whole time, as if he had been holding a note for 2 days and could finally let it go. When they lifted her, the castle breathed in relief and then pretended it had done nothing. The pathologist wrote a report that was unkind to television. No bruises that suggested a fight anyone would win. No drama, only fact. Air went where air shouldn't. Doors remember hands. Gravity doesn't negotiate. The sergeant stood with his hat off a long time in the chapel, because men like him have habits they don't teach and wouldn't know how to put into words if they had to. The archivist cried in the kitchen and apologized to the gatekeeper, who told him to stop apologizing to buildings. Daniel did not run. Running is for men who admit the chase. He stood where he had put himself, under lights he had chosen by choosing her life for her, and he performed innocence with the fluency of a native speaker. He panicked in private, which is where panic spends most of its time. He asked for water with a voice that would have sold a car to a monk. When they finally used the word charge, it fell into the room like iron. Manslaughter, the lawyers said first. Murder, the papers typed. Reckless endangerment, said a judge who'd seen men like him arrange cause and effect until the line between them looked like art. The video from the overlook mattered. The cut chain mattered. The tracker mattered. The note under her door mattered most, because handwriting is a fingerprint's extroverted cousin. A notebook at his apartment matched its neat squares, even to the way he made the letter G protective of its tail. The restaurant photograph in the bag, dated 3 years ago, turned out to be from the night he learned how to perform concern in public and live off the dividends. It started here. It had. Not the death. The story that made the death possible. At the company, her assistant stood before a room and said, "We will not film grief," and the room, for once, believed a sentence without charts. A pivot would happen anyway, because the future has the attention span of a child who wants a toy and then another. A foundation in her name rose the way green shoots rise through ground men believed paved. Sudden, stubborn, uninterested in permission. The dog stayed at the castle with the gatekeeper, running the orchard line like a patrol, sleeping at doors like a tradition. The castle returned to its old occupation, being. It kept the holes it had to keep and let go of the ones that had done enough harm. Tourists came to stand where a photograph had been taken and then held an ash. A plaque near the chapel said the necessary names and none of the unnecessary ones. The wall wore new stone with the embarrassed pride of an old man in a fresh suit. As for Daniel, history did the thing it does to men who mistake attention for immortality. It remembered him precisely as long as it took to finish the trial, and then gave his space to other men and other trials. His panic, perfect in its choreography, is preserved in a single moment of usable truth. A hand smearing mud into a print on the rim of a well beside. A castle that had seen real kings die without complaint. He is a lesson now, and lessons don't get birthdays. On the hill, in the hour between weather, the wind still finds the slit windows and sings the one note it knows. If you stand by the south wall and close your eyes, you can feel a draft slip across your cheek, like a careful animal going somewhere it belongs. If you listen long enough, you may hear a woman laughing the way a woman laughs when a problem finally yields to rigor. It's a trick of acoustics or memory. It doesn't matter which. The important thing is the door in the wall that opens now only to light, and the name on the plaque that refuses to be a cautionary tale and insists instead on being a compass.